So, good afternoon. Representative Thissen and I wanted to make ourselves available to answer questions about what's happening with the internet privacy language that was in both the House and the Senate education bills, and in the middle of the night, behind closed doors, got dropped out of it. I haven't seen whatever the current version is, whatever they're working on in conference committee right now. I suspect, given the questions surrounding this issue, that if it were back in the bills, we would have heard about it. Or one of you would have told us. I mean, you asked a question earlier about that, what's in the education bill earlier today. I think I'm just going to make a few brief remarks, and Paul will make some, and then we just want to open up the floor to answer your questions. The internet privacy question has really caught the attention and really touched a nerve with the public in Minnesota since we got involved in this issue on the legislative floor this spring. And I think what's happening, not just in reaction to the national activity, but I think just generally, people are much more aware of the fact that their information is being taken, it's being used, they're being marketed, it's being commercialized, it's being sold, and they're surrounded now by this information that's out there somewhere on the internet, and they're nervous about it. They're getting more concerned about it, and it's starting to rebound on them as they get notices that their credit card has been compromised or their identity has been taken in some way. Identity theft, of course, is a big issue, and people are getting worried about that. And maybe it's gotten to the point where we need to take additional steps to make sure that people are comfortable with the sharing of their information, at least have the option to say, no, I don't want it to happen. And that's what our focus is in this provision, and I think that's why we've touched such a nerve among the people who are responding, on their own. They're initiating contact with us, saying, thanks for getting out front and protecting our internet privacy.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Senator Latz. And I would agree, first of all, there's few issues that have captured the attention of my constituents this legislative session than the issue of internet privacy. And gotten many communications from my constituents about the issue, phone calls, etc. And I think people are rightly concerned about these issues. Just as they're concerned about the government having access to this information, they should be just as concerned about these big global corporations having access to this information as what is going to happen to it. It's very, very clear that Minnesotans and Americans want their privacy protected. They also want access to the services that you can only access through these internet, their internet accessed services. And the fact of the matter is, these big kind of global behemoths stand at the gateway of those services that you need to get by in today's economy, socially, in many ways, politically, the political discourse we have. And so what I think we're saying, and I think most Minnesotans are saying, is really three pretty simple things. First, consumers shouldn't have to trade away their right to participate in the modern world at the price of giving up their personal privacy. That shouldn't be the case. Secondly, consumers should have a right to understand what these companies are doing with their information, and as Senator Latz said, should have the right to opt out, to choose not to participate without being kicked out of the modern economy at the same time. And the third thing is that the state of Minnesota should have a place at the table in making sure that the promises being made about privacy are being kept. And I think that's all we're asking for. I think Minnesotans would generally agree with that. And I was surprised that there was no language whatsoever in the bill, the omnibus bill that came out, particularly because this passed the legislature 200 votes yes to 1 vote no. And in that context, it is a little bit surprising. I also want to say that I think this continues to be a work in progress, and that there remains openness there remains openness to move forward on this issue, and we will continue to work with that. In particular, I have had conversations with Representative Garofalo, and he continues to be very open to making sure that we can include a provision like this in the legislation. So I did want to make that very clear as well. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that is supported broadly by Minnesotans across the political spectrum, this issue of making sure that our privacy is protected.
So if this is such a bipartisan issue, why is it not?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not the person to ask about that because I am not on the conference committee. I was not part of those behind closed doors conversations. But what I do know is that I and Senator Latz are continuing to reach out to the people who are affected by this to come up with language that is going to work to protect Minnesotans' privacy. And I also know, at least on the House side, that there is openness to making sure that language that we come up with can be included.
At its core, what did your amendments essentially do?
Well,
You can go, yeah.
Well, the House and the Senate have two different amendments at this point. The language is different. And of course, it's the Republicans that are negotiating their conference committee reports. So it's, at this point, it's their responsibility to put something back in, just as it was their decision to take something out.
Yes.
The Senate language prohibits the collection of personal information by the telecoms and internet service providers. And the House amendment applies to that, but also prohibits not the collection, but the sale and the sharing, as I understand it,
Yes.
by not just ISPs, but also other internet provider portals like Google and other websites.
Right. And the House also has language that would regulate, for the first time, microphones and recording devices. So things like, Siri, as an example, or the Amazon Echo that are triggered by voice and can record, voice data, making sure that data is also protected.
And the other piece that's, one part of which is in the Senate side, the other part of which is not, but which ought to be, is we prohibit the ISPs from denying service from those who decline to authorize the collection of their personal information. And then the part that I didn't think of before the Senate floor amendment, but I've thought of since, is also prohibiting tiered pricing based upon a consumer's option to not provide the information or to provide the information. So basically, there's no penalty if you choose not to share your information.
That was never in either of the bills, that tiered pricing prohibition?
That's correct.
Something you'd like to get in if you can, but that was never removed because it was never in.
That's correct. I've got the language for it. I actually had an inquiry from a legislator in North Dakota who had asked about doing a similar amendment in their legislature. And so I sent her the language, but we haven't had the legislative process available to do it yet here.
What have you heard from the chairs on the conference committee about whatever conflict, whether it be about differences in the language or concerns from stakeholders, is holding this up and, forced it to be removed from the bill?
I have heard nothing specific about the reason why it was removed from the bill.
I was told by the Senate chair, Senator Miller, that Senator Osmick and Representative Garofalo were negotiating that part of the bill. And his understanding was they couldn't agree on language, so they just dropped it out entirely. But he told me that, as far as he's aware, they're still working on it. But, I guess they had to get an agreement together, and it's not in there. So we got to keep working on getting it in there.
Yesterday, you mentioned that you didn't know if the governor was supportive of this. Do you have any sense whether this is just a legislative fight or if you have support from the executive branch?
I think the governor, from what I've heard, the governor is supportive of making sure that Minnesotans' internet, privacy on the internet is protected. And I haven't gotten any more, we haven't had a more detailed discussion than that since yesterday.
You also mentioned you were meeting with some of the industry stakeholders. What kind of, are they pushing back against this whole concept, pushing for changes, offering support? What are you hearing from tech companies and ISPs?
Well, I mean, I think obviously their preference would be that we don't move forward with legislation here in Minnesota, and that this be handled at the federal level. I think that with the federal government stepping back from protecting privacy of Americans, that we need to step up here in Minnesota to make sure that that happens. And then, you know, a lot of technical issues that got, you know, fairly deep into the weeds, some of which I understood and some of which I did not.
Representative, you said your bill passed, your amendment, excuse me, passed 201 in the House floor?
130, well, without any no votes, I'm not sure if everybody was there that day, but without any no votes, so we put an amendment in the committee. So it was in the bill as it came to the floor.
Okay.
But then we which was very similar to the language that passed the Senate. But then on the House floor, we expanded that to include companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft and other companies. And that amendment passed unanimously.
And then in the Senate, it was 66 votes to 1 on a floor amendment. You may recall we had a procedural debate over germaneness first, and that generated a lot of conflict. And then Senator Limmer, when the president ruled it was not germane, I moved to overturn the ruling of the chair, and Senator Limmer voted to overturn the ruling of the chair. And that's what gave us 34 votes to determine that it was germane, and we could proceed to a vote on the merits. And on the merits, then it passed 66 to 1, Senator Osmic being the one who objected to it. I later introduced a separately jacketed bill that had the language from the amendment in it, and Senator Osmic then cloned that bill and introduced it himself. So I think it's fair to conclude that there's unanimous Senate position in favor of the Senate language. But, you know, how you vote there and what you do in conference committee and behind closed doors is a different story necessarily. And it appears to be the case here that it wasn't a high enough priority for them to work it out in this conference committee report. And we're saying it ought to be a high enough priority. Certainly the people of Minnesota, given the reaction that we've gotten, believe that it ought to be a high priority. And I think especially given the vacuum that's being created at the federal level. You know, I recognize the concern that the companies have about a patchwork of state regulations. They'd much rather have it done at the federal level. We had the whole debate here in Minnesota already, and we'll continue to over preemption at the state level of local ordinances for a variety of things. But I also recognize that state level policy is often shaped, or the next level up is often shaped by what's happened at the grassroots level and what direction the patchwork seems to be moving. So we have the opportunity in terms of national policy to try to shape that direction by making strong privacy protections here in Minnesota. And I think we have a responsibility, given the way the public has reacted and the way the feds have now neglected that space, to fill that space to protect Minnesotans particularly.
Who have you heard from? You mentioned some big businesses like Google. Are they exerting pressure on people like you or Republican lawmakers?
Well, I don't know who they're talking to on the Republican side. I wouldn't say that they're exerting pressure. There's some information sharing going on from a whole variety of companies that have an interest in the outcome. And, you know, I welcome the sharing of information. That's how we make good policy.
Exactly the same answer. I mean, that's exactly right. So we have heard from a number of the big players, both the internet service providers and the companies that provide portals to the internet itself, you know, like a Google. You know, they're expressing their concerns, certainly, but also sharing information so that we can make the best decision. And, you know, that's important to take into account as well. But the one thing that I do know is that Minnesotans are demanding that their privacy be protected, that they understand what their rights are, and that they get access to the services that are critical to participation, again, in the modern economy, without having to give up all of their personal information and their personal privacy. And that seems like a fair balance for us to strike.
What's interesting is that for the ISPs, not everyone even has a choice to go to a different provider. You know, in the metro area, you may have 2 or 3 providers you can choose from, but in some parts of greater Minnesota, there's only one pipeline to your house,
Or none.
or none, as the case may be. But if there's only one pipeline to your house, I mean, you're stuck. You don't have the choice to let the free market operate and pick a different provider that is more consistent with what you want to do with your personal information. And so that's exactly the kind of place where, you know, regulation should step in and set some baseline standards.
And I also think there's one other larger issue here that kind of gets even beyond what we're talking about right now, and that is that these companies are making tremendous fortunes off the personal information of every Minnesotan. And those Minnesotans are getting no compensation for that whatsoever. And that economic idea seems pretty fundamentally unfair, and I think it's something that we also need to take a look at here in the state of Minnesota. How we could help an average Minnesotan participate in the economic value that is being generated by their personal information.
How would this be enforced if it became law?
It would be enforced by the Department of Commerce because it's under 237. And so if there was a complaint that someone was not following these regulations that were put in place, the Department of Commerce has general enforcement authority that they could bring to bear against the company that's violating the policy.
Either of you gentlemen, and forgive me if the question has been asked already, talk with your Republican colleagues about why this never disappeared, and what kind of reasons are they giving?
We have, I think both, well, on the House side, no real explanation of why it didn't appear, although I would say that Representative Garofalo has expressed openness to including something if we can get some language that works.
And Senator Miller told me that it was Senator Osmick that was negotiating that portion of their omnibus bill with the House. And he indicated that they hadn't come to an agreement on language. So apparently they decided to stop working on it and just drop it out of the bill entirely. You know, Senator Miller is the chair of the conference committee on the Senate side for the jobs bill. He said, sort of, still working on it, but you know that can mean a lot or it can mean nothing. It's hard to say exactly what he's doing, if anything, on it.
Did you have an impression on where the major sticking points are, or what those sticking points are, or how those sticking points are being represented to you?
No specifics have been offered to me about what the concerns are.
Yeah, me neither.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
you.